Chrysalids, chapters 1 to 6. We discussed the various different genres of science fiction. We placed the Chrysalids in the genres of medical science fiction, post-apocalyptic science fiction, speculative science fiction, and realistic science fiction. We looked at the author, John Wyndham, and his role in the pulp fiction era, and also the golden age of science fiction. In terms of the fictional world of Whacknut, this is the place that the novel The Chrysalids is set. We looked at the book The Repentances. So this novel takes place in a world thousands of years in our future, a world that has been destroyed by a massive nuclear disaster. A nuclear bomb, a nuclear explosion has devastated and destroyed all civilization. The humanity that has kind of grown up out of the ashes of this world, they have had no libraries, they have had no technology, they've had no education in any of the things that have happened leading up to this point. So they don't have the vocabulary to understand nuclear disaster. They do know, though, that from the remnants left behind, that there was an advanced civilization that once existed. And for some reason, it ended in a horrific way. So this book, The Repentances, written by this crazy man, was created out of the sort of tattered fragments left over of the Bible after the apocalypse, incomplete fragments, and his own kind of manifesto on what might have happened and how we can make it better. So like many, he calls the disaster tribulation, and he speculates that it was some kind of massive punishment against humanity for, we can only imagine what. But the repentances he suggests is that we eliminate all deviation and mutation from the genetic line to go back to a very pure image of what the human being is in God's image, and then we can kind of redeem ourselves for this happening. So Whacknut is a community that, very cult-like, has organized itself around this belief system and mercilessly punishes, condemns, and destroys any kind of genetic mutation that arises in the gene pool. And they do it for what they perceive to be religious reasons. We looked at fairy tale and myth and the basic quest structure, Joseph Campbell. We had a really fun time connecting the Chrysalids to the story of the Ugly Duckling, David in particular. And we also just compared science fiction a bit to the fairy tale or the quest structure. Science fiction is a genre of fiction that retains this kind of classical structure in a way that many modern realistic narratives do not, because science fiction offers commentary on humanity or sociology or the way we are, where are we going, what are we doing. There's often a moral message or commentary in there, so it lends itself to that pattern in the same way. All right, chapters 1 to 6. A young child named David has a dream. It's a dream of a beautiful futuristic city, and he knows that in his little childish mind, with his short memories and his few years in this little dust bowl of a town called Whacknut, there's no way that he could have come up with the kind of things he has seen in this dream. Spaceships and skyscrapers and the ocean, all this modern technology. So he knows the dream is real. He just doesn't know if it is a distant memory of the civilizations long past, long destroyed by tribulation, the nuclear apocalypse, or is it a prophetic dream? Is it a premonition kind of dream. Could this place exist somewhere? Or could humanity perhaps get there again? This is the kind of thing he thinks about, but he can never tell. He can never tell anyone about the dream, because in his community, anything different is destroyed. And he knows that it is not normal to dream these kinds of things. He also keeps secret the fact that he can communicate telepathically with a small group of friends from the town of Whacknut. Since they're little, they realize that they could send thought pictures and impressions, that kind of communication between each other that other people in the town just couldn't do. So they realized pretty early on as well that this is a difference that we have, and because it's different from the norm, which is something this town is obsessed with preserving, we can't discuss it. They keep it secret. David grows up hiding the dream, and he also grows up hiding his affection and his love for one of the village girls named Rosalind. Her father and his father are bitterly opposed to each other, so their families have grown very divided. This is because her father breeds horses that are super large, and he has gotten permission from the government to do this because it aligns with regular breeding practices. And his father is such a purist. His father is probably the strictest person in the entire town when it comes to eliminating deviances and mutations. That it becomes an obsession of his father's that these horses should be put down, these horses should be destroyed. So this bitter rivalry kind of grows out of that. His father is a preacher, and his father is a town leader who has the reputation for being extremely strict and very unforgiving when it comes to mutation. If there's one deviation in a crop, a farmer's crop, he has the whole thing destroyed. So we kind of get a sense of that his family, although it is the most prestigious family in town, it has the largest property, that kind of thing. It's also, his family is known for being very critical and also a little bit feared. His grandfather, Elias Strorum, actually founded the town, and he came from the East. Ironically, he was likely banished or exiled from the East for having too zealous a perspective. But here in this community, it really took root, and this cult-like thinking and system of eugenics really flourished. So as David grows up, he realizes that many people in the community are not exactly like his parents. They're not as strict and unrelentingly merciless as his father and his parents and his particular family is. He comes to realize this when his mentor, Uncle Axel, who is not really a relative, he was a uncle through marriage, but came to live with them because he injured his leg in a sailing accident. So his uncle has traveled far and wide, seen many places, listened to many creeds, many perspectives, and he kind of gives David the sense that, you know, not everyone really believes all this stuff. Not everyone is wholeheartedly into this, the tenets, but we do so to survive. We all pretend to be a certain amount of normal in order to live in this disciplined society that offers us a certain amount of protection. And if you're smart, he says, you will hide your telepathic abilities, you will lay low like everyone else does and survive, because things are bad in Whacknut. They're pretty unforgiving and intolerant. However, things are brutal in some of these other places that I've traveled. He tells some stories, which maybe sailors tell tales, but also could be. We do know that there are some pretty horrible things that have arisen in this world, destroyed by nuclear apocalypse. some really bizarre deviations and places that are terrorized by criminal activity, places that are just like endless war. So certain amount of safety in a little town of Whacknut. So at this point, David thinks, I'm just going to lay low, and we're going to have to hide our secret. We're going to hide who we are, and we're going to survive in this community by pretending to be normal all the time. Then two very disturbing things happen. The first, he has another dream, and he knows that his dreams, if not prophetic, are at least messages. They are apart from himself and his soul. This one disturbs him enough for him to realize that this is a clear warning that Sophie's in danger. In his dream, she's surrounded by villagers, and this mob of villagers with this kind of torches and pitchforks kind of imagery. She's running from person to person for help. Her dress is tattered. They found out about her toe. And wait a minute, have we introduced Sophie? I don't think so. I'm sorry. So they find out about her toe, and his father ends up slaughtering her, much like he slaughters the two-headed calves and the livestock or the corn that come up with any kind of mutation or deviation. So let's just go back a step. Sophie is a little girl, same age as him, that he discovered playing one day, and he became friends with her. She was never at church. She was never at any of the community events. So he realizes that she's somehow of an outsider from the town. Her parents have kept them apart, kind of living in the forest, under the radar. One day she gets an injury, and he discovers that she has a sixth toe on one of her feet, and he takes her home. The parents realize that he knows her secret, and her parents entrust him to keep the secret. This is dangerous for them because they know who his father is, and they know the reputation of the family, but they respect him and they treat him like an adult, and he keeps her secret. This is the first time that he's really encountered such direct evidence that the belief system that he grew up with is deeply wrong. He grew up surrounded by the signs. The devil finds its way into our homes through deviation. Mutation is the source of all sin. That kind of thing surrounds him all the time. There's posters all over his house like that. Whereas in Sophie's house, there's paintings of horses on the wall. And the parents, when they talk to him, he feels like they're not only listening just to find out what's wrong with him. It's a whole sort of new way of being. And he really grows to love her parents and love little Sophie. So this is the point in his development where he's realizing that these beliefs that he's grown up with, he can't really believe them. They seem a little bit ludicrous when confronted with the reality of Sophie, who is just so delightful and just as sweet and loving and compassionate and smart as any other one of his friends. The second disturbing thing that happens to him to really shake his kind of sense of worldview is raiders from the fringes break into town. So outside the town, there are the fringes, and this is where all the cast-offs, anyone born, any child born discovered to have a mutation, is thrown out into the fringes to fend for themselves. And this is a kind of a lawless, homeless encampment kind of area. So occasionally people from the fringes will break into Whacknut to steal supplies or food or that kind of thing. And a squad from Whacknut will hunt them down, kick them out or punish them. So they've captured a raid from the fringes, and they haul them through town all tied up at the back of a carriage. And David is horrified to see that one of them, this tall man with these long arms and these long legs, has a face that is identical to his father's. And he looks up at his father, and his father's face is white. His father, who's usually so verbose and gives these long sermons on the devil and that kind of thing, has nothing to say. He just walks back into the house. And David notices that on the face, which is identical to his father's, of this monstrous man, he is just such hatred when he's looking at his father. So this gives us a sense of the kind of bitterness and anger that the people of the fringes, or at least this one man, has. I'm not sure, I think I did mention this, but I'm not sure if I did in connection to this particular story, how in the United States there are these cults, these Mormon cults, which of course have nothing to do with the Mormon religion or Christianity, but they are cults that have their own manifestos and interpretations, and then they break off from the traditional religion and sort of build their own self-enclosed society. That's what a cult is. That's what Wachnut is. So in the United States, there are these Mormon cults where the women all dress like in long dresses, in pastel colors, and the men dress really in an old-fashioned manner a bit as well, and they forsake all technology, and they drive it in horses and buggies and that kind of thing. And the men will marry sometimes like 30 girls, and very young underage girls often. So you wonder, when you look at a society like that, what happens to the boys? Because in a culture, you know, this is the thing for monogamy, and the reason why, you know, there's a equal number of men for women. If you have one man with 30 wives, or even 2 wives, there's going to be someone who doesn't have a wife. So what happens, and I saw this on the news, is that when their boys reach a certain age, I think it's puberty, a large portion of the boys of this community are kicked out and left to fend for themselves. And I remember seeing interviews with some of them, and they had no education, they had no wits, they had no worldly knowledge, and some of them end up homeless. They have to sort of pick up the pieces and survive in the city. And if they're young enough, there are also people in the communities who live near these cults who keep an eye out for them and will foster them or will take them into their homes, that kind of thing. So the lost boys, this springs to mind when you think about the fringes and how there's a portion of the population, when genetic mutations or deviations are found in the people of Wachnut, in the youth, they're kicked out into the fringes, into this sort of lawless underclass that exists outside the borders of the town. Whoops. And from the Spider-Man, we can see that there's a lot of bitterness and resentment that has developed in these people. Unfortunately, one day, David and Sophie are playing by the river, and the local bully, Alan, sees her, and he recognizes right away that she hasn't seen her in church, he hasn't seen her at the community events, and his raider immediately goes off, and he wants to inspect her, he wants to interrogate her. She's terrified, she picks up her things, she tries to run, and David tries to fight him off, and this is when we really see the true nature of Alan, who we will meet in upcoming chapters. He pummels him and pummels him. He's attacking David repeatedly in the head. Who knows what would have happened if Sophie hadn't hit him on the back of the head with a rock. He's knocked out for a little while, but he has seen the footprint in the wet sand, and he's seen Sophie's extra toe. So they know that it's only a matter of time before Sophie is hunted down and captured by the people of Wachnut. So David takes her home, and the parents gather up their things, and they realize that they knew this day would come. They have to go on the run. They have to escape Wachnut. David wishes he could go with them, but it would be too dangerous, especially given who David's father is. he does agree to stay in their house for the night because he undoubtedly will be questioned. Alan has seen him. So he does so, and they escape. The next morning when he goes home, it's a pretty bad scene. The inspector's there. Alan has told his father everything. There are villagers looking for Sophie and his parents. The father is irate. Irate that David has known about her and said nothing. This is the point where a very traumatic thing happens to David. He is beaten, and this has happened before. We've seen it. But this is a lot worse than the previous times. He is beaten within an inch of his life. I mean, there are beatings, there's old-fashioned discipline, and then there's this where he could have easily died. He is covered in blood. He's covered in giant welts that are just basically bleeding cuts all over him. And he finally breaks down and he tells his father the direction that Sophie and her parents have gone in. They are hunted down. The father sets off against them. They're captured and brought back. So at this point in the story, we realize that his father, and we've kind of known this, but we realize that his father values his adherence to the repentances, dictates the strict rule of law regarding mutations. He values this a lot more than he values his own son's life. And we realize that this is a house with no love. We realize that this is a place where he can't just lay low and get by and live the rest of his life in hiding, because the level of pain and suffering, not just to himself, but to his friends, to Sophie, to anyone who's different, is too unjustifiably harsh, and it is an unlivable reality here. When we discussed the hero's quest and we discussed what makes a hero, we talked about how one of the aspects that Joseph Campbell identified in The Hero with a Thousand Faces was in early childhood, the hero suffers the unhealable wound. So I think that this would be the unhealable wound that David endures. It's from this point on that we realize that that he kind of gets his marching orders with this moment, and with the story of Sophie. The story of Sophie Wender is chapters 1 to 6. This tells us that if he's going to be a hero, if this is going to be a story that we can really embrace, this moment gives him a destiny that includes breaking ways with the past. We realize that there's going to have to be some kind of break with the way his father has done things and the way his grandfather has done things. That is going to be that kind of story. And a break with his community, and a break with the past. I'm not sure if I mentioned this at this point, but in the United States, this novel was going to be titled Rebirth. This novel was titled, Rebirth. So we get a sense now, in chapters 1 to 6, while he's young, this is the period of time when he's, I think, from 5 to 10 years old, that this gives us a sense of the necessity for a dramatic change, and that as a thinking person and a person with compassion and this intuition that is telepathy has given him, that it's kind of going to be his mission to create this change in his world, if he can, or at least for himself and his group of friends. Okay, so that was chapters 1 to 6. This is Miss Millie here, and I have a short study guide for chapters 7 to 12. First, let me quickly put some of our lessons into a nutshell. We looked at David's dream of the future. It's the very first thing we read in the novel, and that's important because I'm not sure any of us would have kept reading had we entered this world only through Whatnot. It's such a dark, tyrannical existence. So the dream gives us this mystery to solve, and this hope for the character of David, and also for ourselves, because this is kind of a reflection of our world gone very wrong. We then looked at the 1940s and 50s. We looked at some of the influences that went into writing this novel. We looked at how the author worked at a censorship bureau and had just gone through the war. How Joseph's father might have been inspired by Joseph McCarthy, and his name is Joseph Strorum. And how we can kind of look at some of these very harsh characters and situations in the novel as allegorical for things that happened during World War II. The telepathic friends. We thought about the revolutionary new communications technologies that were occurring during this time, and how a science fiction writer might imagine the kind of possibilities that could arise from that, and perhaps a better way of living in the future, more concerned with the mind, or peace and unity, than war and division. We looked at the setting, the Badlands, the Fringes, and the mutants, and the atomic bomb, the devastation it caused, and the awareness that people had now that we have the power to cause this kind of damage. We looked at the idea of a quest, and thinking about David and his friends on a quest, we could see some of these obstacles, trials that they're facing, as hopefully part of a path towards a better form of knowledge, and not just for them, but also for us and the world. We looked at the symbolism of the cocoon, or chrysalids. This is the title of the novel, and this is the extending metaphor that's going to carry us through the whole novel. So we'll be thinking about that, and the idea of rebirth, and the idea of going from one thing to another, transformation. All right, chapters 7 to 12. So I will quickly summarize these chapters, but I'll leave my my summary, which is a bit more extended, on our slideshows page, so you can read it in more detail if you need to. David loves Rosalind, but their families are kept bitterly apart. They have a feud going on because Rosalind's father breeds these giant horses, and David's father is extremely against any kind of deviation from the norm. Two big things happen. So David's mother has a healthy baby girl, and this is a big deal because in this town, births are kept secret and quiet until a certificate is passed, and only then can they tell the community. Once they do make that announcement, they receive a visit from David's Aunt Harriet. Aunt Harriet is cold and pale, and she's traveled a long way by carriage to get there. She's holding a little bundle in her arms, her own baby. She says she thinks it's divine intervention that her sister had a baby around the same time that she did. She begs David's mother to please let her borrow her baby for just a day, so she can pass inspection. But David's mother and father refuse, and they call her all kinds of names, a defilement, a blasphemy, and they ask her to leave. Harriet says some kind of chilling words before she goes. She says, "I pray God to send charity into this hideous world, and sympathy for the weak, and love for the unhappy and unfortunate. I shall ask him if it is indeed his will that a child should suffer and its soul be damned for a little blemish of the body. And I shall pray him too, that the hearts of the self-righteous may be broken. I am not ashamed, I am only beaten. This throws David's father into a rage. He calls it heresy. And he says he was willing to let her inappropriate request go, but for this, she should be taught a lesson. And at this, David's mother cries, and he hasn't seen her cry in a very long time. The next day, Harriet's body is discovered floating in the river with her baby, and this is an image that is burned into David's mind. After this, he's praying to God every day to please take away this curse of telepathic abilities, but every day he wakes up and he is the same. Uncle Axel tells David that it's actually safer in Whatnot than it is in the outlying areas. He's been a sailor and he's traveled all around those parts, and he knows how terrible some of these wild places can be. So he tells David to lay low. He also gives him some comfort and tells him that life is more complicated than the nasty signs on the walls of his home. He says, nobody knows the true image. What makes a man is mind. It's a thing, it's a quality, and minds aren't all the same value. They're better or they're worse, and the better they are, the more they mean. 6 long years pass, and David and his telepathic friends live quietly in the Whatnot community, hiding the secret of their unusual connection with each other. As his little sister Petra grows older, however, she starts to develop the same telepathic abilities. Her abilities are much, much stronger than the rest of theirs. She's a little bit alien even to them because of their strength and their magnitude. They overwhelm the others and drown out their thoughts. Petra has a habit of going out exploring, and she once almost drowns in a river. They all drop what they're doing and rush to the river, where they find her hanging from a branch over the rushing currents. Gossip starts in town over how it started. The group is in for another shock when one of their members, Anne, decides to marry Alan. He's the bully that went after Sophie and reported her to the inspector and caused her banishment. In Anne's words, this is what she says to explain it. They're a very rare group of people, and they've long kind of known they can only marry each other. There's a lot more boys than there are girls in this group. I didn't ask to be the way we are, but I've as much right to get what I can out of life as anyone else. It can't be easy for any of us, but it isn't going to make life any better if 2 of us have to give up all hope of love and affection. 3 of us can marry 3 of you. What is going to happen to the other 2 then? The 2 who will be on the outside. They won't be in any group. Do you mean they ought to be cheated out of everything? The group, of course, is terrified that she will make a mistake and reveal their secret to Alan. They try everything they can, but she cuts off all ties with them. David thinks, our position in our present homes was bad enough. To have to go on living intimately with someone who had no thought shapes would be impossible. For one thing, any one of us would have still more in common with the rest and be closer to them than the norm that he or she had married. David knows that those in the group who do share a close bond, himself and Rosalind and Michael and Rachel, are the lucky ones. For both of them, no matter how far away the other is, can sense and feel what the other is feeling. He invokes the sensation Rochester spoke of in Jane Eyre when he says, I have a strange feeling with regard to you, as if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs tightly knotted to a similar string in you. He says, other people seem so dim, so half-perceived compared with those whom one knows through their thought shapes, and I don't suppose normals, who can never share their thoughts, can understand how we are so much more a part of one another. What comprehension can they have of thinking together, so that 2 minds are able to do what one could not? And we don't have to flounder among the shortcomings of words. It is difficult for us to falsify or pretend a thought, even if we wanted to. On the other hand, it is almost impossible for us to misunderstand one another. What then could there be for any of us tied closely to a half-dumb normal who can never make more than a clever guess at anyone else's feelings or thoughts? Nothing but prolonged unhappiness and frustration, with, sooner or later, a fatal slip, or else an accumulation of small slips, gradually fostering suspicion. So again, this certainly isn't about the everyday person, or when he talks about a half-dumb normal. I think we have to again look allegorically at this as the kind of loneliness of a person in World War II watching large masses of people respond to things like Hitler's speeches, this feeling of fear and paranoia and not knowing who you could trust. If you had a certain kind of consciousness, it would be very, very difficult to connect to anyone else. And I think this is the lack of connection that David is talking about. David is shocked when his Uncle Axel suggests they kill Anne. According to Uncle Axel, it's either them or her. He sees her marriage to Alan as a death sentence for them. From now on, they will be living with a sword over their heads. David tells his uncle that to kill her would be like killing a part of themselves. It would be like a sword inside of them. So the group continues to live quietly under the radar as suspicions continue to grow. Then another shocking thing happens. The bully, Alan, is murdered. He's found with an arrow through his neck. Even more shocking, Anne is so devastated that she hangs herself from the beams in her room. She thinks that it was David and his friends who murdered Alan, and so she writes a letter to the inspector and leaves it in the room, revealing their secret. Thankfully, Rachel gets there first, and she burns the letter, but they all realize it's a very close call. David's shocked when he realizes that it's his Uncle Axel that actually killed Alan. And Uncle Axel has done this for a very surprising reason that you really won't be able to get out of your head. So Uncle Axel, in his sailing days, he traveled from coast to coast and went to all these strange places on the outlands. One of them, there was a bar owner who had his employees under his control, and any horrible thing he asked them to do, they would have to do, and if he snapped his fingers, they would have to dance. And this was because he had their darkest secrets, and he blackmailed them with it. So Uncle Axel says that when he was in church, he saw the exact same expression on Alan's face when he looked at David and his sister and Rachel and Michael as the bar owner had on his face when he looked at his employees. When he saw that, Uncle Axel thought he knew that the same thing would happen to them. David and his friends focus their energies on trying to help Petra control her abilities. They know that this is something that could easily get them caught. She is spontaneous and reckless. She's only 6 years old, but even when they were young, they learned to never speak what was on their mind with even their own families. They learned to hide their things like dreams. Petra, on the other hand, is impulsive. Once again, she goes exploring. She's in the forest with her horse, and this huge ferocious creature from the Badlands attacks. She sends a big telepathic cry that ripples out through the town, and all of them once again go rushing and find themselves at the same place. They rescue her, and they kill the beast. However, they're seen by an inspector from another town. He questions them. He asks for their ID tags. He says it's to make sure they're not a spy from the fringes, but even though he sort of seems convinced after they explain the the situation away, they have a really bad feeling about this. This feeling's proven correct when several days later, Uncle Axel tells David that he has heard a spy for the inspector has been asking questions about him and Rosalind, and these questions are the precursor to a possible launching of a full inquiry. The group discusses how Petra's too young to be interrogated. She's only 6. She wouldn't stand up to that kind of scrutiny. They think that maybe they could pass the interrogation. They've been at it so long. But if Petra was captured, she would be sterilized and she would be banished, and the rest of their secret would be exposed. So they all pack bags just in case they get word of an interrogation. It's a good thing they do, because that night, Sally and Catherine are taken. The interrogators show up at their door and they take them into town. Rosalind sends a distress call telepathically to David in the middle of the night, and he grabs Petra and meets her at her farm. He's surprised to learn that her mother has actually helped them escape. This is a surprise to him because he knows that his own parents wouldn't help him or Petra, that if they found out he had any kind of deviance, they would actually have him destroyed. And again, I think that's something we can only understand by looking at the historical context and looking at the kind of severity of fear and suspicion and alienation between even family members that could occur in that kind of atmosphere. The group is haunted by the fact that they can feel Sally and Catherine's cries as they're being tortured and interrogated. Sally and Catherine do a really good job of lying and trying to buy their friends more time, but eventually they're tortured and they're burned until they confess, and they describe the thought pictures. This sends an official notice out against them, and squads of men from Wagner are sent into the forest to hunt them down. Now they're really on the run. Their nights are spent traveling through the wild forests and taking turns keeping watch while the others sleep. They have to use bows and arrows to defend themselves from capture, and we know that this is going to be the start of many more trials as they try to make their way to a better home. All right, so that's where we are right now in chapter 12. Thank you for your patience. And hopefully, if you haven't read up to this point, you'll catch up here, or you'll get some of that reading done so that we can discuss it together as a class in the upcoming weeks. Thank you. The Chrysalids, chapters 13 to 17. The group realizes that Petra has been in communication with a woman from a civilization far away. She calls herself the Sealand Woman because she comes from a beautiful city by the sea. And this is the same beautiful city that David dreamed about as a child. He always worried that this dream was a recollection from long, long, long ago. Luckily, meeting this woman through Petra shows him that this is a premonition dream, that this city really does exist out there someplace, and he's a little closer to finding that new world where he and his friends can find refuge. Through Petra, this woman tells David and Rosalind that she thinks Petra has great telepathic talents and should be protected from the primitive peoples that inhabit his lands. This is our first little indication of the fact that this is not going to be a utopia. This is not going to be a beautiful, flawless, visionary city. But then again, that wouldn't be real. That's not life. This woman is, and progressively more and more so, for lack of a better word, she's an elitist snob. So David starts to notice, and his friends start to notice, that she really looks down on everyone else. She looks down on people who do not have telepathic abilities. And when she's expressing how shocked she is to find Petra amongst them, they kind of realize that she's talking about them. So when they do go to this beautiful futuristic city, if they do make it there, they're not going to be without their own challenges or prejudices or discrimination. Michael remarks to David that what she was putting across was that she was particularly surprised to find Petra amongst primitive people, meaning us. She was, confirmed Rosalind, not a shadow of a doubt about it. She is, however, willing to appeal to our government to get the funds for a spaceship to find them and rescue them, because she is so enamored with Petra's abilities that she's willing to take that risk. This is huge. This is the first out that they've managed to find in this incredibly hard journey that they've been making through a lot of inhospitable land. In terms of archetype, the Sealand woman is like Petra's fairy godmother. She is incredibly protective and loving and kind, delighted and protective of Petra. However, to the rest of the kids, she comes across a little bit like the Ice Queen, because her demeanor becomes a little bit chilly and dismissive when she has to talk to them. She really is on a mission to save Petra, and luckily they are there to accompany Petra on this journey. A whole different kind of genetic superiority emerges here in this woman's world. In Petra's words, regarding thought shapes, the way they communicate in this city, in this advanced civilization across the seas. They aren't all very good at it. Most of them are like you and David, but she's much better at it than most of them. And she's got 2 babies, and she thinks they will be good at it, only they're too little yet. But she doesn't think they'll be as good at it as me. She says that I can make stronger think pictures than anybody at all. She says that I'll get better still if I work at it, and then when I grow up, I must have babies who can make strong think pictures too. She says people who can only talk with words have something missing. She says we ought to be sorry for them, because however old they grow, they'll never be able to understand one another much better. I can't say I feel very sorry for them at present, David says wryly, and Petra says, well, she says we ought to, because they have to live very dull, stupid lives compared with think picture people. The Sealand woman's superior attitude and long treatises on the advancement of civilization through change and evolution, through change out with the old and with the new. This is a whole nother long spiel of philosophy that David and Rosalind and his friends are pretty exhausted with, because they've had to go their whole lives listening to these kind of manifestos and treaties and creeds in Whacknut, and it has been very onerous and oppressive for them. Now, as they're traveling through the forest, they're really getting the feeling that in this new civilization, it's going to be a bit more of the same. Obviously, this world is stunningly beautiful and so much better in so many ways, but it does have its own sense of superiority and its own precepts, and this is going to present a whole new realm of judgment and possible condemnations or sources of not measuring up, that kind of thing. We get that more and more from her conversation. We do know, though, that Petra is going to do very well there. She's got these incredible abilities that are valued in the Sealand Woman's City. Ambushed and kidnapped. So now we come across a third long philosophical spiel from the fringes, and this will thankfully be the last. So we had the Whacknuts concept of life and tribulation and the true form, etc. We had the Sealand woman's idea of evolution through change. And now they are ambushed and kidnapped, tied up, thrown in the back of a carriage, and taken to the fringes. As they're being hauled along, the fringes people kind of proselytize and tell them their view of life. And again, David is feeling pretty exhausted at this point, and just wishing he and Rosalind could find a place where they could just be and just enjoy life and enjoy loving each other, which is what their ultimate goal has been this entire time. They've only been able to have brief, furtive moments together amidst their opposing houses, amidst all the antagonistic elements around them. And their ultimate dream is to find a place of refuge where they can have a moment's peace and be able to just enjoy their silent, wordless kind of love for each other. But here, now they're literally bound and gagged and being forced to listen to more precepts. I'll spare you, this is condensed from a great many pages, but in a nutshell, if I can remember, the fringes people believe that the deviations are part of an evolutionary process, and over time aberrations will reduce themselves naturally. In Whacknut, they say the devil resides in the fringes, and the fringes, they say the devil resides in Whacknut. It's all about hubris of the old people, arrogance like the Tower of Babel. They thought they had to compete with God, be more civilized than God, all kinds of things. Tribulation was sent as punishment. They stamp upon any change, they close up the way, they keep the type fixed, etc., etc., etc. All these flaws, all these ways we could have gone wrong, all the ways we should have done it better, all the ways we should be doing it now, the way you should think, the way I should think, etc. So again, David is thinking to himself while he's in the back of this carriage. There's an air about the last sentences which again caused me to suspect I had encountered some kind of creed once more. And this is from the outlaws, the renegades, those people who have been exiled. He's surprised to find yet another manifesto expressed with such conviction that it's enough to justify enslaving people or ruining some people or committing murder. Again, this kind of exhaustion that they feel tied up in the back of the buggy, being forced to listen to this, I think must be the exhaustion that the author felt and so many thinking people felt towards the recovery period after the war. From what little I know about teaching, from teaching social studies, I know there was a lot of dictators, there was a lot of manifestos and creeds and a lot of powerful people thinking a certain way and using that way of thinking to justify a whole lot of things for the greater good of all and for the movement of people forward. I think that exhaustion with thinking along those ways, along those lines, must be what's reflected in David in the back of the buggy. So David, Rosalind, and Petra are taken to the fringes leader, Gordon Strorum. This is the same man who, when David was a child, he saw dragged into the fringes after a raid and was horrified to see had the face of his father. He had called him then the Spider-Man. This is his father's older brother who was banished to the fringes when, as a child, his arms and legs wouldn't stop growing. And they realized that this was a late onset mutation and exiled him. He would have been murdered, but his mother and his nursemaid somehow snuck him into the fringes so he can have a chance at life. And he's turned into a very bitter, horrible, vengeful, monstrous character. He covets David's father's position, overwhelmed with bitterness that as the older brother, Whacknut should have been his. And he fixates on Rosalind in a very creepy way. He, just like his father, in a way, he's obsessed with genetic perfection as well. He compares Rosalind to the Whacknut women, and has David, his own nephew, beaten up and thrown out. And he takes Rosalind and little Petra hostage, has them hauled back to his tent where he intends to make them slaves and rape Rosalind and force him to have his babies, out of this deranged desire for not only mastery over what seems to him like a genetic ideal, but also of to reproduce with a lesser chance of deviation. So this way of thinking is still dominating here in the Fringes. In Spider-Man's tent, Rosalind telepathically tells Michael, "I'm frightened of him. He's a different kind, not like us, not the same sort at all. It would be outrageous, like an animal. I couldn't, ever. If he tries to take me, I shall kill myself." Michael threw himself on that like a pail of ice water. "You won't do anything so damn silly. You'll kill the Spider-Man if necessary." Tragically, David meets Sophie Wender again. This is really sad. So he writes, "There was dark hair hanging down on each side of a sunburnt face and the glint of dark eyes regarding me earnestly. The bodice of her dress was ragged, a nondescript tawny color with stains on it. There were no sleeves, but what struck me most was that it bore no cross." "You don't know me, David," she said sadly. "Until then, I had not. It was the way she said David that suddenly told me." "Sophie," I said. "Oh, Sophie." So after being captured as a child, she was sterilized and thrown out into the Fringes. And with Sophie, we get this very tragic representation of a character who has really fallen from grace due to internalizing all the hatred and rejection and pain of being banished from her community, being having all these dark things projected on her, and being exiled. She has lost her self-esteem. She's lost any sense of self, and she really is just a shattered, broken person. So broken, David's horrified to learn that she clings to whatever little scraps of love she can find from the monstrous Spider-Man, even as he's holding Rosalind hostage, and is looking for anyone but her to bear his children. This is something that Sophie can't do because she's been sterilized. So here we have Rosalind captured in the dark cave by the hideous dragon, and it's Sophie Wender who comes up with the plan to rescue Rosalind. And she, because she's the one who can be undetected in the Fringes community, she tells David, "If you go out there, they'll identify you and they'll catch you immediately. Hide in my tent and I'll rescue Rosalind." So she goes up to where Rosalind's being held captive, and she murders the guard with a knife, and covered in blood, she goes in and she rescues Rosalind and little Petra. And David comes to find them as well, once she gives him the signal that this has been done. So I've kind of mentioned how we have sets of doubles in this story, and how we have Aunt Harriet, the tragic sort of side of motherhood, who drowns in the river, as a counterpoint to his mother, the stern, uncompromising woman who just shuts her feelings off. We have Gordon Shrorum, the double image, the doppelganger of his father, one reigning over the Fringes, like the underworld, one reigning over Whacknut. And we have these doubles. We have Rosalind and Sophie. Both of them grew up as little girls in the same town, in the same community. Both were friends with David. But then Sophie's life took a very dramatic turn when her sixth toe was discovered, and she was banished and hunted down and punished and tortured in such a terrible way. So she represents a very, very different direction, a of womanhood. And maybe for this reason, maybe this explains why when she does save Rosalind, even though she's been spared from this hellish life, she pulls herself up into this very snobby kind of stance and demeanor and really gives poor little Sophie a stare down. They lock eyes in these two mirror images. One who fell down this dark chasm of fate. One who was able, even though she had a mutation, to grow up sheltered and protected, grow in the shade, and develop her in a way that preserved her dignity and her self-respect and her sense of self with a loving group of friends and a family. When Rosalind sees what has become of Sophie, what she represents as a fallen woman, as a woman in a state of disgrace, it's so contemptuous to Rosalind that she looks at her with this icy contempt, and won't break the stare until poor Sophie just breaks down and says, "God damn you. You just don't know what kind of life I've had. You don't know what goes into making a person like me. If you had the kind of loneliness and suffering and rejection and brokenness and emptiness that I've had, maybe you could understand what I've become. Maybe you could understand if you've had just no love, clinging to the scraps of love from a monster like this." And she's sobbing on the bed, and she's just grief-stricken and broken. And only when she totally breaks down does Rosalind avert her eyes and feel some contrition. But surprising for me as a reader, because Rosalind has just been saved from a pretty horrific fate, but being confronted with this other path of womanhood, this possibility, this sort of line between what she is and what maybe she could have become. This is so horrifying to Rosalind that it overrides everything, and she reacts by doing what the people of Whatnot do to mutants, distancing herself. "I'm not like you. I'm going to look down on you." Very judgmental, and it's a really tragic scene. And this is one scene where I really warmed up to Petra. It's not like I didn't feel warm towards her before, but she's kind of a little girl who inspires more awe than warmth. She's incredible. She's very smart. She's precocious. She's daring. She's adventurous. She's kind of an uber child. And it's in this scene that Petra is really humanized. And she's really compassionate and sympathetic to Sophie in a way that Rosalind can't be, because maybe Rosalind feels too threatened by this image of a woman in disgrace. It's too frightening for her. She doesn't want to associate herself with it. But little Petra has no such reservation. She rushes towards her. She puts her arms around her. She comforts her. And Sophie reaches out and holds her little hand. And it's a very tender moment of love between them. And this is when I really felt my heart warm towards little Petra, for sure. The Sealand woman is flying towards them in her spacecraft. She's getting closer and closer. As she's flying, she is really shocked and horrified by the Badlands, the desolation. And here we hear another long speech about how could they? How could these old people create this kind of devastation? Clearly, they had this amazing advanced society. Clearly, they had this technology. Were they mad? She says, "There was the power of gods in the hand of children, we know. But were they mad children? All of them quite mad? The mountains are cinders, the planets are black glass, and it's still, after centuries, a monstrous madness. It's frightening to think that a whole race could go insane." She's overwhelmed with emotion as she's describing these terrifying regions to the children. And again, I'm sure that this was exactly what John Wyndham would have thought, or any thinking person would have thought in the years following the war, having witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and going through the shock and terror of realizing, and everyone realizing together, that now there's the power and the capacity to cause this kind of damage in the future. Rachel, Michael, and Mark have been traveling separately, but they're still in communication telepathically. Unfortunately, Rachel is alone and frightened. Michael's trying to help her find her way back to them. The Whacknut squads that have been in pursuit are now encountering the people from the fringes. So the two sides are now converging, and this big battle erupts. This big war, an old-fashioned war with bows and arrows and swords and knives and things like that. This big war erupts, and the Sealand woman's getting closer and closer. David watches as the Spider-Man murders Joseph. Then the Spider-Man and Sophie are in turn killed by Whacknut people. The battle is intensifying, but luckily, the Sealand woman's craft is now descending from the sky to save them. And here we enter perhaps one of the most unusual parts of the novel. Maybe one of the reasons why this novel was never turned into a movie, because this is a moment that's kind of different for story. We know that this chapter is entitled Brave New World, and for that reason we can draw a comparison between this and The Tempest. One thing that I noticed that occurred to me when I read the scene is that in The Tempest, we have these moments of action where Ferdinand is drawing his sword. There's a moment of high drama, and then Prospero will just will say sleep, and everyone will fall to the stage, and this sleep will settle over all the actors, all the players in this production, all the characters. And this is unusual to have all the drama just frozen, just stopped like that. And then we take another turn. The Tempest is this kind of, I don't know if the word supernatural is correct, but I've always loved it, especially in my earlier days of university, because it had that mystical element that could lend to that kind of analysis, mystical analysis in this day and age. It's elemental, it's alchemical. In the same way, this is very much a kind of an essence that the Chrysalids has. So very much like Prospero, the Sealand woman descends. We're at the height of battle. We're in the sort of height of conflict in a normal action movie or plot line. We'd be interested in seeing the results of the conflict, who won, who lost, what steps were taken, what boon was gleaned, that kind of thing. But everything, the Sealand woman says sleep, and everything just freezes. This gossamer web comes from her spacecraft. It encompasses everyone cocoon-like. They're frozen in these gossamer webs that are a kind of advanced technology that knock the person out and actually kill them. David and his friends are really shocked when they learn that everyone is actually dead. It takes them a while to realize this. They're not frozen. And again, this unsettling coldness of the Sealand woman, and hopefully not, but probably her civilization and the way they think about other people, the way they think about people who are not telepathic. We're reminded of this again when she so casually is willing to kill a whole arena of people to save Petra and David and his group of friends. So how do we discuss this unusual ending to the novel? One way we can think about it is the parting of the Red Sea. This occurred to me actually just a few days ago, because there is really no other way other than to think poetically and try to make comparisons, to try to understand this kind of thing. So with the parting of the Red Sea, it's that kind of parable that the Chrysalids is very much like. This is throughout the whole novel, we have the sense that this is really a comment, a sad comment on human nature and society. It's teaching us things, it's showing us things about life rather than merely entertaining us. So with the parting of the Red Sea, this is another time where everything freezes and is suspended. And there's this kind of pathway created by freezing time and space that through faith you can just walk through if you're willing. We can think about this in terms of the search for the promised land, all that wandering in the wilderness. And we can think about it as well in greater depth, maybe in class time when we're in the classroom, through activities and a bit more fun, in a bit more of a fun and interactive way. We can think about comparing it to the Tempest. That could be really fun. On the Sea Land Woman's journey, if this is her quest, she leaves the safety of her harbor, her beautiful city, and she sets out on a quest through these terrifying lands that her world has tried so hard to forget about, to save Petra. Petra is her goal, her treasure, her elixir, her boon. She is the thing that she's bringing back to her people that's worth the expense, that's worth the trial of this journey. And she is delighted with Petra. She and Petra have this incredible unspoken communication where all kinds of things are going on between them that there are absolutely no words for in the human language, that just occur on a level of energy and feeling. They have, I guess, for lack of a better term, such a soul connection that David and Rosalind and the others can only sort of just wonder at and see the tip of the iceberg of. They are really outsiders to this connection. It's described pretty well in the actual novel. This connection brings them incredible joy. So they're extremely delighted and happy with each other, and all kinds of things are being expressed. And we get the understanding that this is a happy ending because at least Petra is going to have a fantastic place in this new world. She embodies everything that they value. She's going to be, she's going to have a good position in this society. Even if it does create a distance between her and the others, we know she's going to be taken care of, and that's a good thing. And we also know that regardless of what the Sea Land Woman has said about the Badlands and Wacknut and the depravity and the nightmarishness of these primitive people, this dark reality, this dark world with all its mutations and damage and disease, it still has created what they consider to be an incredible gem. So out of this horror and darkness has come something pretty precious and wonderful. And that's also a statement. So the Sea Land Woman has been wondering, we find out, if the journey was worth the gas money, if it was worth the expense, the fuel, which is something that she thinks quite a bit about. And as soon as she sees Petra, she is completely convinced it was worth the expense. Tragically, Michael stays behind. He refuses to abandon Rachel alone in the wilderness. He sets off alone to find her. They can't spare the extra fuel to go search for Rachel. They have limited supplies. They have to gather up the kids and fly back to Sealand. So it's sad, it's tragic. We wish that all the kids could make it on the spaceship and head off to the promised land, but only David and Petra and Rosalind make it. And I think the author chose to do this because this gives us some real old-fashioned heroism. And this really is the value, the heroic value that that stands apart from all the others. We have the academic snobbery of the Sea Land Woman, which is which we know is going to have a cruel, unrelenting, exclusionary side to it. We have the primal, barbaric, Puritan practices of Wacknut, and we have the fringes. We have all these examples of people trying to lead their best life through complicated thought systems. But then when we see this, we we sort of touch base again with what is truly heroic in stories and what is truly of value and what this group represents, which is not, which is basically they value each other. They're willing to do something brave and heroic for each other. And so he is the character that embodies that when he makes this incredible sacrifice to not get on the ship and stay in hell in order to not abandon Rachel. So we're given that. And now the end. The group of friends board the spaceship and take off for a new life. And I just realized, actually, today we almost had a spaceship takeoff of our own. It was canceled due to weather, but very excitingly, the NASA program is kicking up again, and maybe another golden age is upon us of space travel and astronauts and wonder and that kind of thing. It's really exciting. Hopefully we'll see that rocket take off soon, and we'll see the space program start up again.